welcome. My name is John Streff, and joining me is Joe Owen. I'm a park ranger at John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site. Joe is a park ranger at Lyndon B. Johnson National Historic Park. Joe, how are you today?
I'm doing good, doing good.
Good, glad to hear it. So we are moving into a series called The New Frontier and the Great Society, an examination of the lives, presidencies, and legacies of JFK and LBJ. So we've spent a fair amount of time talking about these men literally from the moment they were born, and now we're getting in kind of the meat of the matter. So the last episode, we spent time talking about John F. Kennedy's presidency, and today we're going to talk about the transformation out of tragedy, the presidency of LBJ. So as folks I'm sure are well aware, on November 22nd, 1963, John Fitzgerald Kennedy is riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas, when he is shot and mortally wounded. And his whole entourage ends up going to Parkland Hospital, where he's pronounced dead at 1 o'clock Central Time. And so the first question we're going to deal with is, how did the aftermath of President Kennedy's assassination shape Johnson's presidency? I'll start a bit with that, and then Joe will get you in on it. Obviously, this was a shock to the system. Johnson was, I think, 2 cars behind, if I'm not mistaken, Joe. And immediately when the shots rang out, LBJ's security detail jumped on top of him to protect him. He was kept in a cubicle at Parkland Memorial Hospital for the better part of an hour. And I think Kenny O'Donnell, one of JFK's advisors, was the one to deliver the information. And by all accounts, as we were talking about before, that by and large over the course of LBJ's vice presidency, he's kind of pushed to the corner, despite the fact that he has all of this great political knowledge and life experience. This is not utilized the way it should be, and he's mistreated as a human being as well. But what happens in the moments after he's told that he is the president? By all accounts, LBJ steps up to the plate in a way that I think most folks would have great difficulty doing. You have the famous photograph of him being sworn in on Air Force One with Jacqueline Kennedy next to him. And as soon as they land, a few hours later at Edwards Air Force Base, he is facing the nation and telling folks what happened, what's going to go on. In the immediate aftermath as well, he's calling Kennedy family members. He's speaking with Jacqueline Kennedy. He's doing his best to reach out and to make sure folks are comforted. And to be quite honest, and Joe, I want to hear your thoughts on this as well. I think that most of the members of the Kennedy administration were really not quite sure what to make of him. He had been the laughing stock. He'd been the guy, as Joe, as you said in the last episode, kind of shoved to the corner, and they weren't quite sure what to expect. But right away, he's taking charge. And that night, November 22nd, he's very clear that he wants to begin working on civil rights. That's the huge agenda. But over the course of that weekend, of the period of mourning, he is going to try to comfort the American people as best as he can. Joe, why don't you talk a bit about that address that he makes on November 27th that really sort of establishes his agenda going forward?
You bet. Like you said, at Parkland Hospital, Lyndon Johnson was like, what just happened? What am I going to do? What do they expect of me? And, this overwhelming, like anyone would be. But he transformed as soon as he did the oath of office on board Air Force One on the way back to Washington, D.C., he became focused. He became the leader again. He was not the leader of the Senate, but he's the leader of the country. And he was used to being a leader. And he got on, of course, when the plane landed in Washington, D.C., he made the speech about, we're going to mourn. We're going to mourn. We're going to, put collectively our arms around the Kennedy family, the First Lady Jackie Kennedy and Caroline and John Jr. And he kind of gave the indication about how focused he was too. If you saw it in his eyes, he really was focused to being the leader of what the country needed. And he understood how if he was fumbling around or if he was unsure of himself, the Soviet Union, China, the Warsaw Pact would see this is a man who's not decisive. We could really take advantage of this. And so Lyndon Johnson right away transformed himself with that speech as well, like I said, on board Air Force One and when he landed in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, though, as you know, a lot of continued animosity was between Lyndon Johnson and Bobby Kennedy. Well, how President Kennedy's body was taken off Air Force One. President Johnson felt like he should have been there when they were loading off President Kennedy's body, and Bobby Kennedy just walked right by him, just ignored him, kind of gave him a dirty look, and just really ignored him. And that was kind of the insecurity of Lyndon Johnson too. He goes, I'm president now. How dare he just ignore me? But then again, like you said, Lyndon Johnson had, some of the best people. He understood how good Kennedy's staff was, President Kennedy's staff was. Robert Kennedy, Attorney General, Pierre Salinger, Press Secretary, Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara. And so he really needed to have these men on board with him. And so that's the reason why he just didn't clean out the old administration. He understood about how foolish that would be, because they were the best and the brightest. And so he was focused. He understood what he needed to do and what he needed to hold back on.
Again, as we were talking about before, Joe, on November 27th, I think President Johnson is very much establishing the fact that he is in charge. As you were mentioning a few moments ago, and I think it's quite interesting, is he does use lines from President Kennedy's inaugural address, talking about JFK talking about "let us begin," as you said a moment ago, "let us continue," right? And I think as you suggested as well, he's sending messages not only to President Kennedy's cabinet, right now his cabinet, but he's also sending messages, as you were suggesting, to the leadership of both the House and the Senate, that we're going to keep moving forward, and civil rights is going to be the number one priority here. And also, Joe, as you talked about, he connects it to the martyrdom of John Fitzgerald Kennedy as well. And I think that's an important piece, Joe, as you were sort of talking about. LBJ is keenly aware of how emotion plays a role in politics. And if folks are moved by their hearts, their minds are going to follow. And you're going to have a situation where you might be able to have some great changes. As he said, if we don't do this, what is the presidency for? Why are we here? What's the point of all of it? So the next question, again, is for you, Joe. We obviously will spend the next episode talking about civil rights, but how did the Great Society connect with the New Deal?
It was just a direct correlation. President Roosevelt's policies with helping America, helping the unemployment, because first of all, Lyndon Johnson understood about what President Roosevelt wanted to do, because he himself was a victim of poverty. He himself, his family was Sam Jr. When he lost the family's money, he lost the family's money, and they didn't have hardly anything, barely things to eat. And so the poverty, the Great Depression had a great correlation with Lyndon Johnson and President Roosevelt's policies on a New Deal. And I just think it was a continuation of the Great Society, was the ideas of President Franklin Roosevelt. Remember, those two were very good friends. President Roosevelt said, "This young man, this Texan, is going to be a future of the Democratic Party. He's a star." And Lyndon Johnson just took President Roosevelt's ideas of a New Deal and made it kind of broader, even broader for all Americans. And especially with social programs, getting the unemployment. Like I said before in an early episode, Lyndon Johnson did not believe in a handout. He believed in the hand up. And so that was a continuation of Franklin Roosevelt's policies. And like I said, Lyndon Johnson understood about what President Roosevelt wanted to do, because he himself was very poor growing up, and he understood the stigma of having a family be unemployment, of trying to find food, trying to get the basic necessities. And so he understood, he agreed with President Roosevelt's policies, and it was I would say it's the major influence on the Great Society was the continuation. Lyndon Johnson believed all the Great Society was a continuation of a New Deal of Franklin Roosevelt's.
I think those are great points, and I think obviously John F. Kennedy and his family have a very different relationship with Franklin Roosevelt. But as you suggested, LBJ literally is sort of brought into the federal government first through Congress and the U.S. Senate, but he's a New Dealer through and through. And I think, as you suggested too, growing up in the hill country of Texas, he is witnessing what poverty is like, what the effects of the Great Depression are like on the most vulnerable populations in the country, and is also recognizing the power that government can have in bringing about change. So, of course, through the Great Society of Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, the big civil rights bills that we'll spend some time talking about in the next episode, And all of those things are still with us today. I think probably for most Americans, they have no idea that the kind of social safety net that is first created during the New Deal and then continued with the Great Society has literally helped hundreds of thousands of people along the way. So there's that. Now, what I think is fascinating to many folks about Lyndon Johnson is that you have all this legislation that's passed within just, for obviously he's elected in his own right in 64, and between 64 and 65 and 66, all this legislation that is literally going to transform the United States, as you mentioned a moment ago. Simultaneously, you have the war in Vietnam that, of course, had been going on, frankly, since President Truman's administration. President Kennedy sends more advisors. It gets more complicated. So, Joe, from your perspective, how did President Johnson's expansion of the war, expansion of the Vietnam conflict, ultimately impact his presidency?
It made the big difference, I believe. Lyndon Johnson said if it wasn't for he was frustrated. He wanted to have so much more legislation passed, but he thought Vietnam was the wall that would stop it. And he was right. He was very frustrated about Vietnam. Like you said, he was not the beginning of it, nor was he the end of it. He was in the middle. He was in the bad times. He had the honeymoon period from 1964 to 1966. And he was able to get so much passed, so much legislation passed. Americans don't understand how many bills or how much legislation Lyndon Johnson passed that directly affect us to today. And he wanted to get even more passed. But Vietnam was the stumbling block. It was the chance for his political enemies over the years. Being a powerful man, he would make powerful enemies. And so Vietnam was a way for these enemies to block his political enemies, to block his legislation, to get things not even considered. He understood, Vietnam was unpopular, and Lyndon Johnson was the representation of Vietnam. And nobody wanted to support a president who would be sending foreign kids over there. That's what society thought. And so Vietnam was the albatross on Lyndon Johnson. And it was a tragic thing because Lyndon Johnson wanted to do so much more. He told people that he had so much more agenda he wanted to get passed. He did a lot, but he wanted to know people, he really wanted to have a lot more passed. And unfortunately, because of Vietnam, he did not. But at the same time, he understood with the civil rights movement, that was going to be pretty much all of his political favors cashed in. And he was right about that. He really was. So his political power was pretty much nothing. Of course, he was a powerful man. However, not nearly as powerful to get legislation passed through Congress because of Vietnam. And he understood that very well.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And I think kind of to go back to some of the things that you're getting at, you have this, and I think this to me is what's perhaps most fascinating about his presidency is you have all these tremendous successes. As I was talking about, you were mentioning before, and he has the majority, right, in the House and the Senate that allows him to get this legislation passed. But as you said, I like the way you put it, Vietnam is the albatross. He's stuck. With the Cold War rhetoric. He's simultaneously listening to many of Kennedy's advisors, many of whom are quite hawkish on the war. Simultaneously, he's getting messages that things are not going well on the ground. And he's trying to apply kind of domestic policy ideas to foreign policy, which can be successful in some cases. But I think Vietnam was just so complicated that he wasn't exactly sure how to get out of it. And he was receiving bad advice. Simultaneously, I think, as you kind of got into, particularly after the Tet Offensive, even though obviously from a military perspective, the Tet Offensive was a failure, the image that many Americans had was that this conflict was not going well. And so the tide begins to turn. Of course, he makes the decision not to seek out another term and makes that famous speech in March of '68, which very few people saw coming. As a result, sort of throws the Democratic Party into turmoil. You have people like Bobby Kennedy stepping in at the last moment. And then you have Chicago in '68, which begins very, very complicated to say the least. So I think obviously Vietnam and the Great Society rather are very connected to that. Well, Joe, we're just about out of time, but the next episode, we're going to spend time talking a bit more about the legacies of civil rights from both the standpoint of President Kennedy and President Johnson and the impact it still has on us today. So, Joe,
Sure.
always a pleasure speaking with you, and I look forward to seeing you next time. And folks, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Take care.